to present Austin Faith Dialogue, brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries. In the weeks ahead, you will see these and other programs by various denominations.
Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs series at the crossroads of religion and life. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues in the area in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Join us now for this week's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. If you identify the leading religious news stories of 1991, the sexuality reports would have to be near the top of the list. Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue and pastor of Central Presbyterian Church. It was in the spring of last year that the Presbyterian Church made news in headline form with its proposals on human sexuality. This much publicized event was soon followed by similar reports brought before other denominational bodies, including the Episcopalians, the Lutherans, the Methodists. But it seemed that the Presbyterian report created the most controversy. Today we will discuss some of the important issues raised by that report. First, let's take a look at a videotape produced by the Presbyterian Church USA. This tape defines the scope of the sexuality report and the divergent opinion raised within the church on the subject.
We stand with Jesus.
Earlier this year, we Presbyterians spent a lot of time talking, often disagreeing, sometimes vehemently, over the conclusions cited in the majority report of the Special Committee on Human Sexuality. The majority report was hotly debated because it challenged Presbyterians to think about and discuss a justice-love viewpoint as a lens for interpreting the Bible and judging our behavior. That report was so controversial, 1/3 of the Special Committee didn't endorse it, but signed instead a separate minority report. Last spring, Presbyterians were struggling, torn by heated debate brought about by the release of the majority report.
To accept this, the majority report, is to reject this.
It prompted more than 80 presbyteries to send overtures to the General Assembly.
This is Presbyterian. May I help you?
It elicited thousands of phone calls to the church's 800 number. The report's contents became front-page news.
The issue before us at this General Assembly is whether or not we want to continue to be family to each other. It's whether the brothers and sisters in this family want to continue to talk to each other and to converse and to love one another.
This video shows you how the Assembly processed this very controversial report and the issues surrounding it. Arriving at the final vote was complicated. The commissioners and advisory delegates worked very hard to keep our Presbyterian family together. By now, you probably know the commissioners voted not to adopt the human sexuality report, to dismiss the special committee that wrote it with thanks, and to ask the Theology and Worship Ministry Unit to design a plan for studying further issues raised by the report and to present that plan to next year's General Assembly. You may have received a pastoral letter authorized by the Assembly explaining this action. It reaffirms that our denomination believes in the authority of Scripture, the unconditional love of God for all people, the sanctity of the marriage covenant between one man and one woman, and reaffirms previous decisions made in 1978 and 79 not to ordain self-affirming practicing homosexuals while acknowledging their civil rights and the church's continuing need to study issues surrounding homosexuality and homophobia.
Now joining us are two Austin-based counselors who will help us reflect on the meaning of these church sexuality reports and the phenomenon that's surrounding them and how these impact each one of us. Donna Mayfield works at the Pastoral Education and Family Counseling Center located at the Episcopal Seminary. Also with us today is Bob Lively of the Samaritan Counseling Center, which is situated in Presbyterian churches in the area. We welcome both you folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think, Bob, with that being a Presbyterian report that we saw highlighted in that video, that as a counselor and as a Presbyterian pastor, you might give us your immediate response to what it means.
Well, I'm not sure all of what it means, Rich, but when I read the report last year when it came out, my sense was that the church was attempting to respond with a lot of compassion and a lot of love for people who have been wounded by the culture. And I think by prejudicial thinking, by anger toward homosexuals, by what some people call gay bashing. And I think that what we did was go overboard. We lost our biblical moorings, if you will, and we said too much in the way of compassion. In the context of that, I think we lost some of our identity as who we are as people of the Scripture. It's a very complex issue. It's an extremely complex issue, and I think the church, in a bizarre sort of way, tried to say, look, we're not going to legislate around the issue of sexuality, but in saying that, I think in effect what we did was attempt to legislate in the context of sexuality. It was rather a bizarre paradox.
And it was not limited to people that might be hurting in regard to the gay-lesbian issue, but people who were living outside marriage or adolescent sexuality, a variety of issues.
Yes, that's exactly right. It had to do with people who are outside of the bounds of marriage and openly sexual with each other and still wanting to claim that as part of their Christian heritage and so forth. And again, I think what the church tried to do was to please everybody without pleasing anybody.
Okay. Let's do a little comparison. Since the Episcopal Church has been through something of a similar process, Donna, could you make some commentary on that?
Yes, in fact, after seeing the clip that you just showed, there's not much difference from what we have perceived in the Episcopal Church to be going on. We've had some of the same kinds of dialogue. A lot of it has turned into heated debate. A lot of it has turned into polarization of sides, when I really believe that everyone in their heart wants desperately to come to some deeper understanding of human sexuality and its relationship to us as Christians. The problem, as Bob put it so very well, is that it is a very complex issue. It's not a black and white issue. And I think that like many complex issues, it becomes very threatening to individuals. And as a result of that threat, folks so often want a definitive answer. They want a black and white statement that they can hold to and cling to and say, this is the truth, and everything else is wrong. And in any aspect of human life, I don't think that's easy to come to, whether it's sexuality or anything else. But in the Episcopal Church, we are continuing to be in dialogue, just as the Presbyterians are. We have come out with reports after a great deal of study and dialogue among differing persuasions and differing points of view. And our report, much like yours, was received with a great deal of a wide range of feeling and a wide range of responses.
Did your outcome differ from what the Presbyterians came out with, as we just saw?
Not to a great extent, no. We differ in that as the Anglican body, we want to remain in unity in the midst of our diversity, just as I hear the Presbyterians saying they want to do. the way in which we're governed is such that our presiding bishop, our overall governing body, can mandate that studies be done. They can mandate that certain things be talked about and that dialogues take place. But at a diocesan, a local level,
Okay.
it really does fall under the jurisdiction of the local bishop to decide what is going to happen and what isn't going to happen.
So in practice, in the Episcopal Church, you may have some dioceses in which a bishop will ordain gay and lesbian folks, and in others not.
That's true. That doesn't necessarily mean that action has the blessing of the church united.
I see.
But it does mean that, and in some cases there are those who feel like bishops who do that are violating the general consensus of the Episcopal Church. History shows us that a lot of the change that occurs in the church over time occurs when one or two brave people step out of line and attempt to do something new and different.
Well, that is an interesting difference, because the extent to which you have for that latitude, because of authority being divided between bishops, is probably one thing that makes a variety from within denominations. And I think one of the things that caught my attention was all of the media attention that was given to this issue. And I thought to myself, why is that? Maybe this is the first time that the churches have been up front about the sexual revolution that's been going on since the 60s, and that it was being taken seriously and being treated rather thoroughly. And I know Time magazine had an article that came out in the spring that was entitled Pews and Bedrooms, the debate over sexuality. And they said that the Presbyterians had turned thumbs down, the Episcopalians had turned thumbs sideways, and the Methodists and Lutherans were still trying to figure out which way to turn their thumbs. And so it shows the fact that there's the attention by the public. The church is supposed to be the moral leader, and with the perceptions of the church as being unchanging, and all of a sudden, how does the church show flexibility and yet show principle? I mean, this is, I think, accounts both for the interest in the phenomenon and the split within the religious community in response to it. And I think too that the way in which this not just plays itself out in the bedrooms of the world, but in the counseling rooms is where I think you, as clergy, are unique, because you're making your ministry work in counseling. Could you give us a little bit of a sense of how much of your counseling, Bob, entails sexuality issues?
Well, that's a fascinating issue, because what surprised me several years ago when I became a full-time pastoral counselor was how many people had been sexually abused as children. And that's part of the sexuality that needs to be addressed by the church. I would say if you include sexual harassment, 100% of the women I see in my practice, and more than half my practice at any time is female, 100% of those women would report that they had been sexually harassed, a wolf whistle, being touched inappropriately, some kind of suggestion made to them. That's one issue that we're just beginning to address with the media thing that happened last fall with the Supreme Court issue. That to me is overwhelming, and that's a part of what happens in counseling. I have to deal with that consistently, and I routinely, in a very loving and caring and slow, methodical way, get to the issue of childhood and to the issue of sexuality in childhood. And I'm astounded by how often I find that people have been deeply wounded in their psyches and in their spirits around the issue of sexuality through sexual abuse. So that's one piece of what we deal with, and it doesn't just play out in terms of sexual dysfunction in the marriage today or in a person's life, but it plays out in the context of the greater context of a sense of who I am. What does it mean to be a child of God? What does it mean to have value? What does it mean to have worth? I think what happens, Rich, in childhood, when children are exposed to sex too early, which is sexual abuse, they have what I call a tormented sense of self sometimes. They have no sense of self. As one writer says, their preciousness is taken from them at a very early age. And that's played out in a variety of ways. Now, that's an issue of sexuality, but it's not what the General Assembly was talking about per se. But
Right.
that's a profound issue that I see daily in my practice.
I know you write this article for the Austin American Statesman. What's the name of it again?
On Earth as It Is.
On Earth as It Is.
Right.
Okay. Well, as it is on Earth is the depth of pain that
yeah.
people are experiencing in regard to the sexuality issues, and yet, you know, I think one of the reasons that we connect it with spirituality is that when you have this relationship to God and among the people of God, it's supposed to be joy, and sexuality is supposed to be joy,
Right.
and not pain.
That's right.
So that we're out of the garden when we're, I suspect in your work you find something of that same hope for what it can be, and yet the disillusionment when it so often isn't.
Very definitely, and I would concur with Bob that a large majority of the people I see in my office have been sexually abused. Some men, but the majority women. The sexual harassment goes on right within the church itself, especially now that we're seeing women ordained in the various denominations. It's happening, and it's got to be looked at and addressed and brought out into the light. The whole issue of sexuality and spirituality is something too it's ancient. It goes back to Plato, if we want to go back that far, of wanting to separate our spirituality from our sexuality, our soul from our bodies. And as Christians, we know that that's not good, that that's not what God intended.
You see the biblical point of view as being different in that regard.
I do. I see that what God created is good, and God created the whole of us. And our sexuality is part of that creation.
Yet isn't a popular conception or misconception, as you're implying, that the Bible is saying that sex is bad and that, you know, it's dirty, and that we've got this Puritan ethos that has been carried over into our time? And isn't that still a prevalent view that you get as you talk to folks?
Yeah, a lot of people are resistant to coming into a pastoral counseling office. I don't know if you find this or not, because they believe that we're going to preach to them, or that we're going to impose some kind of puritanical point of view on them around their sexuality, and sex may very well be their issue. But I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer said it better than anyone. He was delighted that the early church folk had included the Song of Solomon into the scripture. He said, because it gives Christians permission to be passionate and about life and about sex in an appropriate context. And I think that's a part of our humanity, is our passion. And I encourage people in an appropriate way to celebrate their passion, to not be afraid of it, to learn to be comfortable with who they are as sexual beings, but also as emotional beings and physical beings and spiritual beings. It's not a suggesting, it's all a part of the same whole. And I think our role as pastoral counselors is to help people integrate their spirituality into a wholeness where they can be comfortable with being fully human. And being sexual is part of being fully human.
Libido, the word that we usually use in terms of sexual energy, really means life force. Life force.
Earlier this year. And with about $670 billion under management, the new United Bank of Switzerland would surpass Fidelity Investments as the world's biggest asset manager. And experts say big money center banks like Chase Manhattan and Citicorp can't ignore the global consolidation anymore.
I don't think it means that most U.S. banks will be moving more aggressively into international capital markets. But I think our largest dozen or so have to do that if they're going to continue to do business with multinational global firms.
But some fund managers say these big banks may not combine with each other, but partner with other asset managers. And any
is mistreating people, which can go on in marriage as well as outside.
Exactly.
And I became much less, I've gotten where I've trusted I'm not judgmental at all when people come in whatever relationship they have. And I think that that non-judgmental spirit would be essentially when you do Christian counseling, as well as if you were doing it in a secular sense. But what would you say, just to pick up on this biblical side, would be if when the Presbyterians had their report or the Episcopalians may be drifting away, what would be your understanding of that?
Well, when I hear the phrase thrown at me, someone throws at me, living in sin, my immediate response is to say, who among us doesn't live in sin? I mean, I'm a sinner. I'm real conscious of some of my sins. Some of it I don't know about, but I'm a sinner. What I'm interested in working with my clients is what is love. And love, the way I view this, in the context of love, if a man and a woman have decided to live together, in a very real sense, they have said at some level there's a commitment. And it may be an abusive commitment, it may be a superficial or destructive commitment, but they've made some kind of commitment to be together. And they're coming to me not to be judged, not to be preached to, but they're coming to me to help them live more comfortably in that commitment, to make it work in some ways that they're not even sure what they're asking for, except they just know it doesn't work. I think most relationships are more unconscious than conscious, and what I want to help them understand is how to lift the unconscious part of the relationship to the surface, to look at it very carefully, to understand, am I loving this human being? Use the Apostle Paul's view of love. Am I being patient with this human being? I get really tickled by the music I hear on the radio which talks about love. One of my favorites is, you might as well face it, you're addicted to love. Well, I wrote a column about that a year or so ago. It says, you might as well face it, you're addicted to patience, or you might as well face it, you're addicted to the other things that Paul said about love. And biblical love is very much oriented toward a decision to be kind and loving and patient towards someone. The cultural view of love generally is sexual, or it's fun, or it's just superficial.
But as a pastor, does this preclude your marrying people who have been living together?
No. No, I have never made that a criterion, because I tell folks I think you're already married. What we are here to do is to make this public as your friends and family as witnesses before God. That's what we're about.
What about, say, a gay couple or a lesbian couple that comes to you, Donna? You're ordained.
I work with, in my counseling practice, I work with gays and lesbians. I've done what would be referred to as marriage counseling, even though we don't recognize their unions as marriage in our culture or in the church. I see their unions and their efforts to live together much in the same way that Bob does. I see it as an effort to try to find a way to commit to another human being in a loving way. The very same issues that gay and lesbian couples bring into the counseling sessions are no different from the issues that heterosexual couples bring in to marriage counseling. It's the same issues. How do I love this person? How do we stay committed to one another? How can we lovingly help one another grow? What does all that mean?
Well, you know, one of the things, too, I think that has been a result of the stir that's been raised by these sexuality reports is to force people to go back to Scripture and see what really is there.
That's right.
One of the things that I think our Presbyterian report was helpful on was to point out that that the condemnation that we have assumed was toward gays and lesbians in the Scripture is different. That first of all, lesbians are not condemned. For instance, in the Old Testament, it's males who are same-sex relationships, because the spilling of the seed, the wasting of the seed of the semen was considered to be a threat to the life of the people, the future of the people.
That's right.
There was also the issue of rape.
And rape. I mean, Sodom and Gomorrah was a gang rape issue, both heterosexual and homosexual, and not assuming a caring relationship between people.
That's right.
That's right.
That's right.
And so I think that the extent to which we need to be true to Scripture means to look at it in its original context. And when viewed that way, I mean, Paul was talking about cult prostitution and this sort of thing in his remarks about homosexuality.
The other thing, too, that I would like to add that I think is very important is that we have a tendency in the church right now to isolate out one of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not commit adultery, and set it up as the greatest sin that a human being can commit. And while I do believe adultery is a sin, definitely, I also believe that adultery can be committed, if we understand it in its Hebrew sense, as a false relationship. In a lot of different ways, not just sexually. Jesus, interestingly enough, said very, very, very little about sex. He said a whole lot about the sin of pride. He said a lot about the sin of bigotry and self-righteousness. But we don't seem to focus on that very much as a culture. We take a great deal of pride in being judgmental against other people, which is the very thing Jesus taught against. So I have a problem with, separating out one aspect of human
Do you echo that?
behavior.
Oh, yeah. 20 years ago, Dr. Stuart Curry at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary wrote a small book called Human Sexuality in the New Testament. And in that book, he makes a real clear point that Jesus neither condones nor condemns homosexuality. Jesus just doesn't make a stand on that.
Doesn't say anything.
Right. And I think that needs to be regarded very seriously by the Church of Jesus Christ, that we don't know that he ever said anything negative or positive for it. So possibly it wasn't terribly important to him. What was important to him was love.
Quality of relationships.
Right, the quality of relationships.
Yeah. Well, I think the quality of your input today has been something that will be of real value, not only within the church as viewers are looking in, but those outside the religious community, I think, might be enlightened by the fact that some of the preconceptions that have been brought to this whole topic are being changed. And I would like to thank you, Bob Lively, as the director of the Samaritan Counseling Center and Presbyterian clergy person down in Mayfield from the Episcopal, your office is out at the Episcopal Seminary.
Yes.
And for your input on this, and we'll look forward to continuing this dialogue in various forms in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rich.
And we are glad that you folks looking upon this today, and hope that next week you'll also join us for our next edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Richard Thompson. Peace be with you and a joyous New Year to you.